Yeah, it doesn't really need to have the scale of Cosmonarchy though. The only reason why I go for like large scale stuff is because I really like the cooperative slant, and it doesn't have to be cooperative with other humans, but cooperative slant of large scale battles. That's what I'm drawn to. And I like the idea that I'm getting immersed into a battlefield where I can be a critical component of how the battle ends, but I'm not responsible for literally everything that happens. And you'll notice that, like, it's no surprise then that the least interesting aspects of game design or games in general are when it's just a fucking I'm a cameraman capturing all of the footage and following like prescriptive discussions or like instructions, or it's like I have to go find all the gameplay instead of some of it happening around me. Um, I think that that's bad form in an objective sense because you're basically not making a game where you're meant to express skill as much as you're making a game where you're meant to experience a linear story. But even beyond that, like my personal bias is definitely towards having such a scale that the world feels alive, and the main reason or main way for the world to feel alive, in my experience, is just to make it so that there's a bunch of shit going on, for lack of a better term. There's obviously a bias that I have against games that don't actually involve playing a game. And those would be like the narrative heavy games like walking simulators, What Remains of Edith Finch or whatever, Gone Home, stuff like that. Or anything like Half-Life 2 or even Half-Life 1 where you don't really have an open-ended way to experience the content. It's just experience this content the way we wanted you to. Like, to me, there's not really that much of a distinction between Half-Life 1 and one of those walking sim games, because it's go here, then go there, in that order, no questions asked, and you get some creativity with how you do it, but it's almost a formality as opposed to it being an actual element of the construction of the game where the intent was to put control in the hands of the player. That's almost never where it actually is. That's almost never the focus of game developers who are making those kinds of games, where you are meant to experience a narrative and you are a cameraman in that sense, where really it doesn't matter who plays. Like, you can get the same effect watching a Half-Life 1 playthrough from somebody else like me playing the game than you can playing it yourself. There's very few cases, you'll notice, where you're in these like more sprawling open areas where maybe you would have a completely different approach to solving a puzzle or dealing with an enemy composition than I would, because there's very few cases in the base game. There's a little bit more in the expansion packs, or at least the one expansion pack. Maybe it was Opposing Force or something. Whatever the one that wasn't Blue Shift. There are some expansion content that has a little bit more going for it, but that wasn't even the original devs. In the base game, there's a lot less possibility for you yourself as a player to express a different playstyle than me, a Let's Player, that you might be watching play the game. And I think the biggest issue there is that I'm not really playing a game then. I'm experiencing a narrative, and I'm moving between points in the narrative, and like the story's kind of telling itself in that sense, instead of me influencing how the story is told. Nothing that I do is reflected, for example. Like, it's a given that I'm going to overcome the obstacle AI that is just there to slow me down and to provide some formality of you having engagement. And once that's done, it's not like, did I take a long time to do it? In which case things are different. Was it really hard for me to do it? In which case my character will, be a little bit more beleaguered in their voice acting delivery. Spoiler, there's no voice acting in Half-Life. And then is there going to be some reaction, something different that happens when I do something different than another player? And if there's not any prescribed reaction because there's nothing programmed in by the developers to adhere for that, and there's nothing to discover where there's no emergent gameplay that is naturally going to change with the way that I approach these things, then yeah, odds are that you're not really playing a game as much as you are experiencing an experience, for lack of a better term. That's the biggest issue, is we don't have the terminology to describe walking simulators. We don't really have the terms to describe interactive novels or whatever. Like, we just don't have the language to do it yet. And so those are lumped in with video games. And as a result, that has corrupted the understanding most people have of what a video game is, or what a video game could even be, because most people are used to this sort of poisoning of the well that admittedly is, maybe I'm making it sound a little bit more nefarious than it really is. I don't think it was deliberate. It's just that because nobody bothered inventing language for interactive experiences that are a little bit more narrative driven, nobody has like some pithy summary term that's caught on like wildfire and is widely used. They just call them games, even when they are expressly not games. There might be some really brilliant walking sims out there that have some really great characterization, good character development, really nice storytelling and story framing, good shots that are automatically sat there in the cutscenes or whatever, like well directed, well choreographed. That might be the case, but for one, not my style, not really what I'm interested in, and that's totally fine, right? That's a subjective critique, or not even a critique, just a reality. But the objective nature of it is that you can't judge them like a video game where the bulk of the storytelling is meant to be developed by the player. You can't judge them by the same metric because they're not deploying the same tools. They're not even trying to be the same thing. It's just that we don't have a term for that, right? So I think that's where a lot of angst happens against those kinds of games where people look down on them. I don't look down on them as much as I just don't understand, like, I look down at the classification mostly. You can't call them games because they're not really the same thing. They're not the same thing as playing Brood War 1v1 and the entire outcome of the game being dependent on you or your opponent and what you guys do. You can't compare them to more open-ended games, like even the old school Doom games where you're going to pick a different weapon than the other guy, and there's so much opportunity for you to do something different. And like that's confined to very specific arenas in Half-Life 1, and even then it's very hit or miss, we'll say inconsistent in terms of when it actually happens, when you're allowed to play something, and compared that to when you can actually play it. Now, there's going to be specific pockets of gameplay in those games, but for the most part, you're just moving from point A to point B in a narrative, and you can make that satisfying because that's what movies do, right? Good movies do that because it's always on rails. You can't rewind. I mean, you could rewind, but you can't rewind and do something different. You can't go down a different path. So yeah, I think most people just, there's a reason why those types of games are looked down upon, and it's not really what we want to poison the well over here in our territory of actual games. So we need to come up with a better term that doesn't corrupt people's understanding and fuck with people's dictionaries, because there's some merit to that experience, but calling it a game is what I think creates a lot of animosity. Like people, the fact that they are very different things and shouldn't be called the same thing is evident in the fact that you have to be in a different mood for it. Just like I have to be in a different mood to watch a movie than I do to play a game. It's the same thing. It's a different genre. It's a different medium entirely. Just because it uses point and click interaction does not make it a game. Just like, I don't know. There's so many different examples you could go for, but you get the idea. There's more to it than what we've got so far.